imperialism. And with the full acknowledgement to everyone that no one has seen the Industrial Revolution lecture because I failed to post it. So I don't think that matters, though imperialism is informed by industrialization. It is a product in many ways of industrialization. There's some really, really important links there that we need to make note of. And so be thinking about that when you do go back and watch the industrialization lecture. But if our narrative in this class has been trying to figure out how a region like Western Europe, and by proxy the United States, could rise to this position of prominence in the 20th century world, we are approaching the apex of that narrative, the climax, if you will, with imperialism. So what is imperialism? If you look at the word itself, and you flip-flop the I and the E, empire is the root of that word. Building an empire is a simple definition. Another way to define it would be that during this period, we see Western European nations and later America and a few others, like eventually Japan, but nations establishing dominance over other nations and exploiting them economically. So nations establishing dominance or a level of control over other nations and then exploiting them economically. National dominance and economic exploitation. Now, how is this different from what we saw with the age of exploration and these same nations like Britain and Portugal and Spain coming to the New World and conquering or otherwise exterminating in one way or another Native American peoples, enslaving them, enslaving Africans and bringing them to the New World, and then using their labor to cultivate cash crops? How is this substantially different such that we call this the age of imperialism and something new? Well, the answer to that question is these nations are now industrialized. We're talking about the industrialized nations of the world. And that brings with it something new. Well, it's the impact of industrialization. It's really fundamentally twofold. Number one, when you go back and watch the industrialization lecture, I'll pose the question of why, in God's name, of all places in the world, would industrialization begin in England? One of the answers to that is that England was blessed with certain mineral resources, like coal and iron. So you know that resources are important to industrialization, and at a point, it's about more than just the resources that you have at home. Here's the key. Industrialization demands that you have access to more and more and more resources. More of resources that you might have, whether that's coal or iron or something else, and more of still other resources that you maybe don't have at all, and maybe don't even have in your existing colony, but maybe they do have it in, say, South Asia, India, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, West Africa, South Africa, Egypt, and so on. And we'll talk about which resources, but I want to go ahead and say I said twofold. What's number two in terms of the impact of industrialization? Industrialization gives you the ability to take those resources by force. You have industrialized armies and navies which give you the superiority in arms to go and simply take these resources by force. to colonize these parts of the world, and not necessarily in terms of setting up colonies that would be an outlet for your people to move there and grow and prosper, but simply colonies that you could use to exploit economically. Remember, establish dominance, exploit economically. Establishing colonies for the explicit and almost sole purpose of extracting resources. Is that all making sense? So what kinds of resources might we be talking about? And I mentioned coal and iron, which maybe you've got access to, but maybe you need a little more than you got and take it somewhere else. But what about other resources? And I know you haven't seen the industrialization lecture, so you're at somewhat of a disadvantage here perhaps, because I would have mentioned some of these kinds of resources. Now, I would have talked about, I think, with the culmination of the so-called Second Industrial Revolution in America in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the automobile revolution and advancements, certain advancements in terms of scientific research into chemical processes that could be applied to industrial production and invention of the electric motor. In any case, getting back to the automobile, what resources must you have to build automobiles and to run automobiles? Oil, right? So that's kind of one of the more obvious resources that if you're Britain or France or one of these other imperialist countries, you don't have at home, but they do have in other parts of the world, it's there for you to go and take. If you have the superiority in arms to flex your muscle and go and do that. What else? I mean, you need iron to make steel, to make the frame of an automobile, right? What else do you need? Well, you need glass for the windshield and such, but you've got that within your colonial empire already if you're, say, Britain. What else do you need, though? Say again?
You might need like certain animals, like leather, like for cows or horses, so you might need certain.
Absolutely. What else? Well, let me be more direct. What does every automobile from the very, very first to the one that you may be driving right now have that connects it to the roadway? Rubber tires, which are made of rubber, which, believe it or not, grows on trees, which sure as hell don't grow in the climate and the soil of Britain or France, but it does grow in West Africa. If you could go and establish colonial operations there, take land there, set it up for your corporations to go there, you could displace the people living there in villages who then have no choice to, who were, by the way, making their living and subsistence with things like livestock like cattle and other such obvious things. But once they're displaced off their land, they have no choice essentially to get by and make a living, but to work for that corporation, growing rubber or whatever else it may be. Palm trees for palm oil is a resource that can be put to numerous uses. Various other metals like aluminum and zinc and nickel, things that could be used in the production of steel that I talk about. LG would say ad nauseum in the industrialization lecture, which he accuses me of making into a science lecture. So you have that to look forward to. What else in terms of resources, and not to harp on this too, but I talk about in that lecture the telegraph. The railroad and the telegraph revolutionized communications and transportation in the industrial age. It gets to the point where they have figured out how to run telegraph cable underneath the ocean. And if you're Britain or France and you have this global empire, that is truly revolutionary. When you talk about it would have taken months to get a letter from Paris or London to Southeast or South Asia, where your colonies are. And with the advent of the telegraph, and especially the undersea telegraph, you're talking about a matter of hours. But in order to lay the telegraph cable underneath the ocean, you need a certain kind of latex to coat that wire, which doesn't grow in Western Europe, but it does grow in Vietnam. And so French Indochina becomes a major source of latex, which is yet another example of a resource that you could go and take by force and use to your advantage. Not all of the resources that these nations would seek out and take are necessarily directly connected to or correlated with industrial production. So today you could look at some Dutch or British companies that have their roots in South Africa, where there are an abundance of diamonds, and these companies, through marketing, convince women of society that every woman who gets betrothed needs a diamond ring, which then becomes a thing that everyone must do, and these companies like De Beers get to make a fortune off of diamonds, which are brought out of the mines by exploited South African laborers and so on. So sometimes precious metals could be the kinds of resources that you seek, but more often than not, there is some connection with industrialization and industrial production. Questions? When we talk about what kinds of technologies, I'll offer just a broad overview because we have an entire slide there on the technology of empire. But what I mean is you have things like steamships and machine guns that other nations don't have and don't come close to having, and this gives you the ability to not only establish dominance over them, but to even to begin to go into places where you previously had not gone during the age of exploration and colonization. Underlying all of this is an upsurge of nationalism, the ideology of national greatness, the greatness of a nation and of a people. A nationalist believes that their people that constitute a nation are truly better than literally everyone else on earth. And what better way to prove that than by building the greatest empire in the world and by industrializing farther and faster than anyone else, by acquiring resources by force and so on. And so all of this dovetails together. Industrialization, imperialism, and nationalism are the fervent belief that your nation and your people are superior to other nations and other people. Informal versus formal, we'll see that imperialism can look different depending on which nation we're talking about and where we're looking at and when. As we'll see with, for example, the so-called scramble for Africa, that involves direct or formal imperialism where these nations establish colonies with colonial governments and direct control over local peoples, and everything about the administration of that colony is geared towards producing resources for the imperialist country. When we look at the United States and some other nations, and in particular examples, we'll see that it could be more informal, could be through your corporations, it could be through missionaries, and could be a sort of ideological imperialism. As we'll see in the case of China, it could involve what are known as treaty ports and not necessarily the carving up of China as you saw with Africa. In other words, it didn't always involve nations establishing formal colonial administrative control. And hopefully it'll make more sense when we look at specific examples of informal or indirect imperialism. All of this, though, is justified through a sense of racial superiority, through racism, more or less. Primarily the idea that white European peoples, Western European peoples specifically, and again by proxy Americans, were simply superior to other peoples and their civilization superior to other civilizations of the world. You guys are hopefully familiar with Charles Darwin. First, to systematically explain the process of natural selection and evolution of species. Well, a man named Herbert Spencer applied those concepts to the development of human civilizations. The idea that human civilizations adapt over time, and that what you see eventually is the, quote, survival of the fittest. The fittest or best civilizations rise to the top of world civilization. If you believe that, and if you survey the world with a Eurocentric mind in the late 19th or early 20th century, you see that you've industrialized, you have the ability to establish your dominance over and exploit other peoples of the world, you might come to the conclusion that your civilization was the greatest in the world. You see? Which then, of course, you can take a step further if you're a nationalist and say specifically the fill-in-the-blank French, British, Dutch, American people, and so on. You could also take it a step further and argue, as did the British poet Rudyard Kipling, that it is the white man's burden to spread your civilization to other peoples of the world. To give the gifts of your superiority to other peoples on earth. It's your, when they say burden, they mean it's like a burden you carry. It's something you must do. It's your duty to spread your advancements to other parts of the world. And that's the way that they see it. That's the way they rationalize it. Now, of course, when they go to places like West Africa or India or Vietnam, or in the case of the United States, when you have informal imperialism in Latin America, and they go and they build railroad networks and run telegraph cables and dredge ports and so on, do you imagine it's really for the benefit of the fill-in-the-blank people? No, it's all about extracting resources, consolidating empire, and this is the capitalist world after all. It's about making money, right? Through your corporations, through your banking interests, and so on. And so, of course, the idea of white man's burden is a sham. It's a rationalization. Questions about any of this? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go into more detail about informal and formal?
Yes, and we will kind of parse that out as we go through, and hopefully it'll make more sense when you see specific examples. But to be clear, formal imperialism would be what we're going to see in the case of, say, Africa, where the French and the British and others go there, establish control, and literally set up colonies with like colonial administrations of their people. And you have Africa carved up into various colonies that are directly controlled by those countries. Does that make sense? Yes. Informal, an example would be like we're going to see in Latin America, I think, examples of American companies establishing operations in these countries, like, say, Honduras. The United States never establishes a colony in Honduras with like a local American administration that runs the colony, but they do have corporations there that have so much control that they more or less control the government of that country. Does that make sense?
So kind of like a monopoly.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Or, as we're going to see, China is not carved up into actual administration level colonies, or like the British do establish direct control over India. But China instead sees these nations take control of various port cities for the purposes of trade on their own terms. And so again, if it's clear, if it's still unclear at the end of the lecture, we'll dive further into it. But hopefully, once you've seen an example of informal imperialism, it'll make a little more sense. Go ahead.
So informal imperialism is like banana republics?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so like Hawaii was pretty much acquired as an informal,
Until it becomes a U.S. state, in which case you're talking about
didn't
formal
Dole
imperialism, right?
take them over?
Huh?
Didn't Dole take them over?
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause like the queen, I forget her name, but it was like the queen of Hawaii, right?
Yeah, Lilia Kalani. Yeah. So Matt's had my U.S. class, and you'll see this soon too, in which we talk about the so-called banana republics. That was kind of what I was referring to with Honduras. He mentions Hawaii. So the U.S. has there's a fruit company that goes there, and with the backing of its own like mercenary military forces, establishes control, takes control from the local queen. And so the U.S. at that point has not made Hawaii like a colony, but you have an American company that's dominating that kingdom, as it were. So that would be at that point an example of informal imperialism, but eventually Hawaii becomes a U.S. territory and a state, at which point you are talking about formal imperialism. It's a little bit confusing, obviously, and honestly, it's not tremendously important, so I don't want to spend too much time harping on it. But here's a map, a very imperfect map of the imperialist world. It does show you clearly how the African continent is carved up into formally administered colonies by these European nations. That's what kind of kicks off this age of imperialism, the so-called scramble for Africa that we'll look at more closely. And it shows you how the British have administrative control of India. The British have established a colony in Australia, the Dutch here in Indonesia, the French, as I mentioned, in Indochina, where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are. I say imperfect because what it doesn't show you is that these coastal Chinese port cities are taken one by one by these imperialist nations, including eventually the United States. It also doesn't show you the many examples of informal imperialism on the part of American corporations in the United States, like Matt said, the so-called banana republics in Latin America. It does show you that Japan begins to assert itself as the lone East Asian imperialist nation, and it takes control of Korea.
Aren't they subject to imperialism too? Japan by like the United States when they initially first opened up?
Yeah, gunboat diplomacy, where the U.S. sends a big fleet over there and flexes its muscle, and
Perry over there.
yeah, Admiral Perry, right? But Japan kind of quickly adopts and adapts, and determines that it will not be dominated, and in fact wants to establish its own imperialist operations. Of course, that thrust, along with America emerging as the dominant imperialist power eventually in the Pacific, will lead those two nations to eventually fight one another in World War II. But let's look at Africa a little more closely. Well, no, take it back. Oh, and there, speaking of, right? So we'll eventually get to Africa. Let's look first, though, at the technology of empire. Well, nothing's more important than steamships. You've known for a few weeks now, as our narrative has developed in this course, that one of the things that sets these Western European nations apart is their constant pursuit of advancements in seafaring, and the abandonment of those pursuits by other empires like China, or in the case of the Ottoman Empire, their defeat in naval warfare at the hands of these European nations. And now, once you see the industrialization lecture, you'll know that steam engine has been invented and applied not only to industrial production in factories, but in this case to seafaring, the advent of the steamship. Steam-powered vessels powered by the steam engines themselves, powered by coal, And the vessels themselves, no longer simply wooden, but ironclad initially, that is wooden and covered in iron, and then eventually steel. I'll talk probably at too much length, as LG will tell you in the industrialization lecture, about the production of steel and the so-called Bessemer process, which makes the production of steel cheaper and more efficient. And steel can be used to build the locomotive and the railroads and skyscrapers and other infrastructure, and eventually ships. Which, by the way, you know, when the Portuguese were sailing down the coast of Africa and mapping that out, and they established those trading forts along the west coast that later would become slaving forts, they didn't venture beyond the coast. The interior of Africa remained controlled by Africans. There are a variety of reasons for that. One, they probably would have gotten malaria, but now they have a sense of modern medicine. They have quinine they can take to stave that off. Two, they didn't possess at that point the superiority to conquer a lot of those African kingdoms or nations. And three, and perhaps of most practical importance, you couldn't take a sailing vessel and sail up the Nile River or sail up the Congo River. But you sure as hell can take a steamship up the Nile or up the Congo. And you could take a steamship with heavy firepower, artillery, and you could take troops armed with rifles and eventually machine guns. And you could bring to bear not just a steamship or two, but if necessary, if you faced a strong adversarial power like the Sudanese, if you're the British in Northeast Africa, or in Southern Africa, the Zulu, you could take an entire army to Africa and deploy it. And it doesn't matter if there are 10 or 20,000 of those soldiers, if you've got a few hundred who are armed with machine guns. They could be deployed on the field of battle by a small team and eventually by one soldier and lay down a withering stream of constant fire. Early machine guns, this is a Gatling gun, I think this is a Maxim gun. See, with this one, it just rotates the barrel. And here, they figured out how to harness the power of the recoil to load the next bullet. And you no longer need a team, and obviously you can deploy that as needed wherever on the field of battle. It's mobile. And so we have these examples of incredible battles where these imperialist powers could be dramatically outnumbered by soldiers who fought, valiantly, bravely, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when one side has this kind of technology and the other does not. And then I mentioned the telegraph earlier too. Think about the huge empires of the world that we've talked about in this class, like, I don't know, for example, the Mongols. And how quickly that empire fell apart because it got too big to administer, even when you split it up into the khanates. With things like railroads and the telegraph, you've eliminated that problem. You've eliminated the problem of overextending an empire when you can communicate with your officials and you can issue troop dispatches, for example, since we're talking about the technology of warfare, in a matter of hours as opposed to a matter of months. You remember in my U.S. class when we talked about the Battle of New Orleans? Andy Jackson fighting against the British in the War of 1812, and it was completely irrelevant because the peace treaty had already been signed in Belgium. But they didn't know that because it takes months or weeks for that message to get from Europe to the United States.
I think I remember.
It doesn't matter.
I remember.
Right. Well, you just had it, right? We just had that lecture a couple weeks ago. So anyway, that's not going to happen anymore with telegraph technology. Questions about this or anything else? This is a Japanese rendering of an American warship. Stylized, obviously, but you can see how it was received, which was very much how it was intended to be received, as very menacing and threatening, right? And fire and belching smoke.
They're called the Kuro Fune.
Nice.
It means like black.
Excellent. So you know something of Japanese history?
I just looked it
Oh. You've got a Google machine. I see. What's up, man?
Wasn't it the Germans who initially like started inventing like the big guns and stuff initially, and, like the U-boats and stuff?
Once we get into the 20th century, Germany certainly takes the lead in the technology of war. We're going to see that especially during the two world wars of the 20th century. Definitely in the case of submarines, the biggest artillery you've ever seen, bombers and so on. Yeah, we'll definitely, when we get into the Great War and World War II, take note of Germany taking the lead in the technology of warfare. So, I want to remind you of something I think we've talked about in here before, maybe not. I thought when we talked about Napoleon, we discussed this, but now that I'm thinking about it, perhaps not. But the concept of a balance of power. And I know we at least briefly talked about Napoleon and the fact that he builds this grand army, more powerful than Europe had ever seen, very nearly conquers the entire continent. That was, of course, in the early 19th century. We're not even 100 years removed from that. No one had forgotten that. And no one wanted to see that happen again. No one wanted to see any one European nation become substantially more powerful than another. And if you put that into the context of imperialism, if you are Germany and France, you don't want to see Britain go out and build this great colonial empire and have access to all these resources and leave you all behind, right? And pose some sort of grave or existential threat to you. And you could flip-flop that with any of these other nations. Nobody wanted to see anybody else get substantially more powerful, wealthy, etc. So all it takes is one of these nations going into Africa and establishing colonial control of one region for everybody else to fall all over themselves to do the same thing. Does that make sense? Oh shit, the French have established colonial operations in Algeria. We better, go get some colonies of our own. And this is what leads to the so-called scramble for Africa. That will see very nearly every acre of the African continent colonized. In 1870, only 10% of the African continent was under direct European control. By 1914, in the outbreak of World War I, it will be 90%. So in the span of 40 years, you go from 10% under direct European control to 90%. And look, beyond the idea of maintaining a balance of power, there could be varying motivations, I guess you would say. Obviously, mineral resources are key. Access to mineral resources. The ability to establish plantation operations for things like rubber and palm trees like we talked about. Occasionally, it's perhaps to protect the interests of your Christian missionaries that have established operations in some area of Africa before you've gone and established colonial control. Sometimes the motivations could be strategic. Take, for example, Egypt, which is colonized by the British. Britain, as you know, as you actually may not know, I'm trying to think back to just from a couple of weeks ago. LG's going to eat me alive in this video, I feel like. And that's fine. He's going to accuse me of being unhinged. Anyway. The British had long since established colonial operations over here in India. And it obviously takes a long time, even with steamships, to get around Africa into the Indian Ocean, right? But they realized if they took control of Egypt here and the Sinai Peninsula there, they could build a canal that would connect the Mediterranean with the Red Sea and eliminate the need to go all the way around Africa, the Suez Canal. So, but in order to do that, you would need to establish, or you would preferably establish colonial control of that area so that you could operate and protect the integrity of the canal. And so that was, Britain's motivation in colonizing Egypt. Well, look at the rest of Africa. The French established control over Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Now, most of this is the Sahara Desert, of course, but North African coast. You have then the Italians will eventually establish control over Libya. The French have much of West Africa that's today, numerous nations like Mali and Niger and Chad over here, Senegal over here, Sierra Leone, the Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. The Portuguese established control of some areas of West Africa as well. You had the British in Nigeria and the Gold Coast. You have the Germans with control of what's now Namibia or Southwest Africa, and also over here in Tanzania, the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique, the British with South Africa, which they actually take from the Dutch who had gotten there first. What is now Zimbabwe, or what was known then as Rhodesia, which is named for this unhinged individual right here, Cecil Rhodes. You can see 1 foot in South Africa, 1 foot in Egypt, symbolizing the British grip on the African continent. What else? Oh, the Belgians in the Congo, perhaps the most brutal of all the colonial regimes in terms of exploiting local people, forcing them at hard labor, imprisoning them for petty crimes, subjecting them to various atrocities and so on. The Belgians really take the lead in those categories in terms of their colonial operations in the Congo. So, do you know what is the one African nation that manages to avoid imperial control? I don't know if you can tell from the map or not. Ethiopia. Oh, well, there it is, staring you in the face. Ethiopia, through shrewd operations on the battlefield, exploitation of mountainous terrain in the north and central parts of Ethiopia, perhaps the ineptitude of the particular nations, most notably Italy, that tried to establish control over it and so on, they managed to, at least for now, avoid imperialist control. Questions about any of this? I mentioned earlier that even when they met with stiff, organized resistance, these European nations are able to overcome that through their technological superiority. I'll give you some examples, and you don't need to know or memorize these numbers. But take, for example, 1893 Zimbabwe, or what was known then, or would become known as Rhodesia here. 50 British troops with 6 Maxim guns were able to kill 3,000 Ndebele soldiers in the span of about 2 hours. Take, for example, Sudan, a battle at Omdurman in Sudan here, which is now 2 nations of Sudan and South Sudan. In the span of 5 hours, 20 British soldiers with 20 Egyptian conscripts were able to inflict 11,000 casualties on the Sudanese army. And so technology makes bravery, courage, numbers all obsolete. Other examples. I mentioned the British in India. When last we looked at India, it was under Mughal rule, the Mughal Empire. Remember, the Turkish outsiders established control, same as with the Safavids and Ottomans, and convert to Islam, but also have to manage a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society in terms of Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. Well, the Mughal Empire was hopelessly weakened, as you will recall, at the time of British colonial expansion in this region. And initially, it's kind of an example of informal imperialism, where the British East India Company takes control of certain port cities in India for purposes of trade. But the East India Company progressively comes to take control of more and more and more, becoming a quasi-government in these areas, backed by British military force. And in 1858, the British government assumed direct rule over essentially the entirety of the Indian subcontinent. The Queen becomes the Queen of England becomes the Empress of India. And the British Parliament will establish, along with the Crown, a civil service, an administration comprised of British subjects, and a viceroy or a governor. The famous British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli calls India the jewel in England's crown. The greatest colony we have, in other words. You know what was one of the main resources that they got from India? And it's important if you're Britain, especially we talk about in my U.S. class at length, of course, the American Civil War, 1860s, a time which Britain could not rely on exports from the southern United States of this material for their textile operations, cotton. It was important to have a colony like India and another colony like Egypt from which you could import cotton when America is mired in a catastrophic civil war. Not to mention, isn't it preferable to have your own colonies rather than having to get it from some other country, the United States? Under direct British rule, India undergoes a significant industrialization, but again, think about for whose benefit. Yes, there's a dramatic expansion of railroad mileage in India during this time. It becomes the largest railroad network in all of Asia. Growth of industrial factory production, the commercialization of agriculture, but all for the benefit of British corporations and the British people. There is a certain amount of assimilation on the part of some Indians, that is assimilation into British culture, adopting British culture. Many Indians are educated, or at least those that are of wealth and means are educated in British universities and adopt Western dress. For example, this individual, I don't know if you can read that, but can you tell who that is? You perhaps recognize him if he was a lot older and if he was wearing the dhoti made of khadi, the white cotton cloth wrap, which he wore as a matter of protest. Yeah, that is Mohandas Gandhi, yeah, who was a British educated lawyer about whom we will talk at length in another lecture. Needless to say, most people on the lower end of the social ladder see not only no benefit from British rule, but in fact suffer from it. And if we're thinking about the reasons why Gandhi would later adopt that traditional style of dress as a matter of protest, and that was something that was a wrap, that dhoti he had made himself. It was made out of what we call homespun cotton. It was what I'll talk about in the industrialization lecture, cottage industry, people making things like textiles in their homes that are then purchased by merchants who sell them to other people. If you industrialize, you kill cottage industry. And so you have Britain swoop in, and its corporations are getting this cotton from plantation operations that they run, and it's going back to Britain itself and into the textile mills in cities like London and Liverpool and Manchester, and then finished product textiles are coming back into India at a marked up price, all while you have driven out of business anybody, any average people who were engaged in cottage industry type production. So this is why later Gandhi would adopt that traditional homespun dress. And also as a protest against cultural assimilation as well. What about China? And I've mentioned several times now the so-called treaty ports. Similar story here. When last we talked about China, it was the Qing dynasty. The Manchus, remember? Similar story here in that, just like with the Mughals in India, the Qing dynasty finds itself hopelessly weakened at the time of a concerted European arrival. Take, for example, what happens vis-a-vis Britain with the Opium Wars. The British were growing more than cotton in India, and just north of India and Afghanistan. Opium, which could be developed into and used as a drug, which turns out a lot of Chinese in the western reaches of China have a taste for, despite the Qing government banning it. And British traders began smuggling it into China. And a lot of people in China get addicted to it. And the Qing government tries to stop the British, try to compel the British government to have its merchants cease and desist, but they do not. And this leads these two nations to war more than once. And these are wars that the Chinese lose, which Britain then forces the Qing government to sign a series of so-called unequal treaties, which the title kind of speaks for itself. Through these unequal treaties, the British get control of Hong Kong, which control they have only within the last few decades relinquished. And the British get the authority to dictate terms of trade in certain port cities. Control of so-called treaty ports, wherein their officials, their government or company officials, would not be subject to Qing law. And where they would be able to, when I say dictate the terms of trade, I mean they get, depending on where and when we're talking about, more or less tariff or tax-free trade operations. They can establish warehouses in these port cities, corporate administrative operations established there, and so on. Other nations will eventually follow suit here, particularly after the Boxer Rebellion. There had been a rush of Christian missionaries into China from different nations, not just from Britain. And a group known as, and you don't need to write this down, but I think it's the Righteous and the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, or something like that. Hence the Boxers. This is a group of Chinese who are disgusted by the presence of these Christian missionaries and how they are seeking to convert the Chinese and, in their minds, upend Chinese civilization in the process. And they rise up in rebellion and start killing these Christian missionaries. And the Qing government is powerless to stop it when these imperialist nations send their own troops into Chinese territory to put this rebellion down. Imagine the once mighty and powerful Qing dynasty at a loss to do anything about it as other countries send their own troops into your empire, into your lands, to put down a rebellion of your people, to protect their own missionaries, and then force you to sign unequal treaties giving them access to treaty ports. And we're not just talking about the British anymore. Who all's represented here? First of all, you have this incredibly racist depiction of the Chinese, of perhaps the emperor there. Who's all sitting at the pie here, carving out their own little piece of the pie, or symbolizing access to treaty ports of their own? Who is this?
Queen.
British Queen Victoria. So we got the British. What about this unhinged looking individual?
He looks like he's from Austria.
Germany.
Oh, Germany.
Well, the Austrians are ethnically German. Habsburg Empire. You're right there. What about this lady here? The depiction of Lady Liberty representing the French. Perhaps the French Queen. Japanese are at the table. The Russian Tsar is at the table. So everybody's carving out a piece, and the United States eventually decides, it wants to get its foot in the so-called open door as well. The U.S. makes a show of calling for an open door policy in China. Don't carve out these spheres of influence and exclude other people. That's like mercantilism. We've moved beyond that. What the U.S. really meant was, don't shut the door on us. And we want for mixed metaphor, we want our piece of the pie too. So this shows you East Asia, British control of India and Burma or Myanmar. I mentioned Afghanistan as well. The French in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, or Indochina. The Dutch down here in Indonesia. The Spanish, who continue to be left behind in the great world domination game, but are hanging on at this point. They have the Philippines. The Japanese extend into Korea and eventually beyond. And what this map doesn't show you is all of this. These are the various examples of treaty ports. And I mentioned Hong Kong down here. And you knew this was going to happen. Hang on. It's important to me, as you know. There's Hong Kong, which the British had control of for a century or so, and it reverted back to China fairly recently. But as part of the British Empire, the people living in Hong Kong have enjoyed relative freedom and democracy, right? Which you don't have in communist China. And so the Chinese government claimed that they were going to allow, something like one nation, two systems. I can't remember the exact phrasing of it, but they were going to allow the people of Hong Kong to continue to have freedom and democracy. Well, that looks like it's a threat, and that's why people in Hong Kong have been protesting in recent months, if you've been following that. That was getting a lot of news coverage until COVID happened, right? In any case, there are other port cities here. What had been known at the time as Canton, or what's now the city of Guangzhou. That is a massive, massive city. In fact, that region there, I may have mentioned this before, is one of the most heavily populated regions on the entire planet. You're talking about Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. But the treaty port cities extend all the way up to Tianjin, which is next door to the capital of Beijing.
So would you say those places are more civilized and more like technologically advanced than the other nations or other places inside of China?
I would say that they do undergo a measure of industrialization, similar with India. And certainly if you got into, the interior provinces of China, from Sichuan to Hunan and all the way out to Shenzhen, definitely those are, vast majority agricultural areas. That being said, the Chinese had built significant infrastructure, like you consider the Great Canal and other subsidiary canals and so on. So it's not like the interior of China was, some sort of backwater. But yes, European nations are going to ensure that they have what they need to conduct their operations in these port cities, and again, for their benefit. Much time we have? Not enough, but that's okay. Just a couple of examples of American imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. You mentioned Hawaii earlier, Matt. The United States, once it gets its foot in that open door, let's see if we have, it's split in the Pacific, that's okay. Then you're going to have American steamships traveling from the Western United States across the Pacific to get to those port cities, right? The Pacific Ocean is vast and steamships run on coal. You would need to establish some naval bases in the Pacific on some islands to serve as coaling stations, refueling stations. And that's initially why the Hawaiian Islands come on the radar of the United States. But no sooner does the U.S. set up naval bases here in the Hawaiian Islands than American corporate interests realize, oh, this land is fertile, the climate is great. We could set up sugar plantation operations on this island. And in fact, we could, now that we have steamships, there are exotic fruits that we can harvest from places like Hawaii that we can get back to the United States and into American grocery stores and into American kitchens before they go bad, which you couldn't have done in the days of sailing vessels. So things like pineapples, for example, you could grow in Hawaii and sell in America and perhaps make a lot of money off that. And such was the vision of Sanford Dole and his Standard Fruit Company, which makes promises to the queen of the Hawaiian people and says, we're going to help you industrialize, white man's burden, and so on. It just give us some land, and give us more land and more land. And when they do things like build railroad network and a telegraph network and so on, again, it's only for the benefit of their commercial operations. And when the Hawaiian people get displaced from their villages, these plantations to be built, and they're left with no choice but to work for the Standard Fruit Company, where they're exploited and paid a miserable wage and treated like peons. And eventually, when the queen decides that she needs to stand up and do something about this, the Standard Fruit Company uses a mercenary army with the backing of the United States military to overthrow the queen and proclaim Hawaii to be a republic, but then establishing as the standard for voting in that republic, for being a citizen, the ownership of a certain amount of property, which effectively disenfranchises most of the Hawaiian people. So they made it a white man's republic. And then they set about the process of gradually petitioning the United States government to become a territory of the U.S., and of course Hawaii eventually becomes a state. And why would they have a vested interest in becoming a territory or a state? Well, if you're another U.S. territory or state, then you're not going to be paying tariffs or taxes for the importation of your pineapples and such, right? Similar process unfolds in Central America. And I mentioned Honduras, but you could also talk about Nicaragua and Guatemala, where Standard Fruit and also, and even more especially, the United Fruit Company make similar promises to local governments, gobble up a bunch of land, displace a bunch of local people, force them essentially to work for the corporation for miserable wages. And they establish plantation operations, growing especially bananas, which again, with steamships, you can get from so-called farm to table, to use today's, as LG would say, show-off food terminology, before they go bad. And United Fruit Company makes a fortune off of bananas and coffee and other things that is grown on their plantations in these countries. They become, in fact, the largest employer in all of Central America. And if people rise up and protest, be it the people themselves or the local governments, United Fruit Company has a mercenary army which it can use to do exactly what Dole and Company did in Hawaii, overthrow the government, systematically murder the people, and so on to consolidate or protect their control. In effect, then, the company, the corporation, the American Fruit Company, in this case United, has become more powerful than the government itself. In effect, they are running these countries at their will. In other words, these countries like Guatemala and Honduras, they have become what we call banana republics. Nominally, free and independent nations that are in fact and in reality controlled by an American fruit company. What's that? Can you translate for us?
La huelga de. Okay, I know it's something.
50,000
workers.
Right.
50,000 workers.
Yep.
La I don't know that word. Huelga.
You know, I had a native Spanish-speaking student in a previous class, I guess last year when I taught this, who also had not familiar with that word. I think it's more or less strike, like a labor strike.
Yeah. It makes sense because the strike of the
50,000 workers, right? Yep. Honduran workers
Exploited for 50 years.
for more than 50
For more than
years.
50 years of a monopoly of the United Fruit Company,
Yep.
something like that.
Yep, and this is a just cause, right? So workers rising up against the United Fruit Company, but to no avail. And if it's a government trying to stand up to United Fruit Company, to no avail. And I mentioned that even there were coups and overthrows of governments engineered by United Fruit Company. But never, as with the case of Hawaii, where it becomes a territory, that never happens in these cases. So these remain examples of informal imperialism. Because the U.S. never establishes direct, formal, administrative control over these nations. It's carried out by proxy, if you will, by your corporations, like Standard and like United. And there's another kind of meld, but it's eventually taken over by United. Which, by the way, do you remember, Matt, what the name these corporations go by today? One of them's easy enough. Dole, right? Standard is Dole. Remember what United changes their name to?
Oh, it's the lady like the she had like a.
Yeah, they decided they're going to adopt like a new name, a Latin-sounding
I
name.
forgot the name. I still like the logo of it. So.
And they have their label will be this Latin-looking lady with the basket of fruit, on her head.
I don't remember the
So
name.
if you go into Kroger or Publix and you see you got your Dole products and your Del Monte, which does basically the same thing in California with Latinos there, and then you have Chiquita. Chiquita is United.
Is that on tortillas?
Do what?
That's not on tortillas. I remember the girl with the fruit.
No, but there is a Latin company that has a similar looking logo that does do tortillas. Yeah. In that case, I think that's actually like a Latin company, as opposed to Chiquita masquerading as one with their Latin sounding name. Anyway, that's enough, obviously, for today. Well, there you go. Do you believe that the most important thing for Chiquita is the quality of their products and services and the good relations of their workers? Or is it to obtain profits, right? There's a racist rendering of the Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii with Uncle Sam, and the fulcrum is sugar there. This is, I'll let you go. We can go over that at the beginning of next time if need be. The upshot should be clear by this point. European, or Western rather, American and Western European economic, military, and political dominance of a global world and exploitation of the benefits of a newly global economy. What we're going to see moving forward, though, is, of course, imperialism like mercantilism is a great competition, as some of you noted on the exam. Great competitions between nations lead to great conflicts between nations. With mercantilism, it was the 7 Years' War and many other conflicts we didn't get the chance to talk about. With imperialism, it is the so-called Great War, what we now call World War I. Furthermore, the exploitation of workers worldwide is going to lead to some real soul-searching about the nature of capitalism. And there are going to be some ideologies that emerge that are revolutionary in their critiques of capitalism. And we'll see how and where and when that plays out as well. That's it. Thank you.